As I mentioned in my past video, don't do this. I would not recommend adding the entire wedges. I would juice the orange and add orange zest. No one likes that pith flavor. They each get a cinnamon stick and 1 clove. I wouldn't add 2 cloves, but do what you want. Handful of raisins. I would recommend chopping up the raisins instead of putting them in whole so that all the flavor can be extracted from the raisins. Raisins add flavor and tannin, but they're not an adequate source of nutrients. Next recipe says add water until it's 3 inches from the top. I'm using reverse osmosis water. The water profile really isn't important like it is in beer making. If the water tastes good to you, it's probably going to taste fine in your mead. If you do use well water, it's a good idea to boil it first to kill off any bacteria or parasites that might compete with the yeast and potentially spoil the batch. So I don't have any caps for these things, so I'm going to put some plastic wrap on it and give it a shake. This is an important step because yeast need oxygen. It's part of the metabolism process. So this is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1 of this video, I'm taking the Joe's Ancient Orange recipe, which is the most popular beginner mead making recipe, and I'm changing only one thing. But it's one thing that I think is super critical. I'm sure a lot of people were thinking I was going to change the yeast. No, I'm going with the same yeast that Joe recommended in the recipe. Ideally, you would use a wine yeast in this situation, but the goal of this recipe is to keep it simple for new mead makers. And bread yeast works just fine. Recently, I've revisited using bread yeast, and I've made a couple of traditional meads just to see what bread yeast does to it. And if you take care of the yeast, it's going to take care of you. You can make good mead with bread yeast. Speaking of taking care of the yeast, we've gotten to the modification of this recipe that I think is crucial. Your success or failure is dependent on a healthy fermentation, and that's why yeast nutrient is so important when you're making mead. When yeast is thrown into this environment without nutrients, it produces off flavors like nail polish remover and jet fuel. Before we learned about the importance of nutrients, people would age their mead for a year or 2 before those off flavors would go away. And I still hear all the time, mead needs to age a year before you can drink it. That's simply not true. In another video, I made a mead that was done very clean and delicious in 7 days. So you're done. Throw in some sanitized airlocks and wait. This is 4 hours after the pitch, and you can see that there's already activity in both of them. Follow along and I'll keep you updated. Stay tuned for part 3.